You ever have one of those moments where a single word slips out of your mouth before your brain even signs off on it, and suddenly you're standing there in the wreckage of your own sentence, wondering if you can somehow reach out and pull it back into your mouth before anyone notices? That happened to me on a random Thursday evening, over a pot of burnt spaghetti sauce, and it ended up rewriting the next 20 years of my life. My name is Terrence Boyd. I was 31 years old, and Naomi Price had been my best friend since we were both 11 years old, sharing a bag of sour candy on the back steps of Jefferson Elementary, because neither of us had anyone else to sit with at lunch that day. That's 20 years of friendship if you're counting, and believe me, 20 years is long enough for a lot of things to happen. Braces, prom dates who weren't each other, thankfully or unfortunately, depending on how you look at the whole story. College, different states, different cities. My divorce at 28. Her broken engagement at 29. Through every single one of those chapters, Naomi and I called each other first. Not our parents, not our siblings, each other first always. People used to ask us constantly, "So when are you two just going to admit it?" And we'd both laugh it off the exact same way every single time. This practiced, easy laugh, like the question was the most ridiculous thing either of us had ever heard. "We're just friends," I'd say. "He's like my brother," she'd say. And for the longest time, I actually believed that. I really did. I want to be honest about something before I go further into this story, because it matters for understanding everything that came after. My marriage to my ex-wife, Chantel, ended for a lot of reasons, most of them boring, ordinary reasons that marriages end for: growing apart, wanting different things, the slow erosion that happens when two people stop actually seeing each other. But there was one thing Chantel said to me during our last real conversation, right before she moved out, that I brushed off at the time and thought about constantly in the years since. "You know the wildest part, Terrence?" she'd said, arms crossed, not even angry anymore by that point, just tired. "In 3 years of marriage, I never once saw your face light up around me the way it lights up every single time Naomi walks into a room." I told her that was ridiculous. I told her Naomi was my best friend. That's just what old friendships look like. Comfortable, easy, familiar. Chantel just shook her head and said, "Terrence, I'm not accusing you of cheating. I know you never touched her, I know that. But there's a difference between never touching someone and never loving them, and I don't think you've ever actually looked at the difference honestly." Then she left, and I spent the next 2 years telling myself she was wrong, mostly because it was easier than sitting with the possibility that she wasn't. Naomi, for her part, went through her own version of that lesson around the same time. Her fiancé, a guy named Derek who I never fully trusted, called off their engagement 8 months before the wedding, and when she finally told me why, sitting on my couch at 2 in the morning with a bottle of wine we'd mostly finished between the two of us, she said, "He told me he felt like he was competing with a ghost the whole relationship. Said no matter what he did, there was always some invisible standard he couldn't meet." I told him that was ridiculous. But Terrence, if I'm being honest with you right now, I think I know exactly who that standard was. I just never let myself say the name out loud. We sat with that comment hanging in the air between us for an uncomfortably long moment that night, and then, like we always did, we both quietly agreed, without a single word actually being spoken, to change the subject and pretend it hadn't happened. That was our pattern, honestly, for years. Little cracks of honesty would show up in unexpected moments, and both of us would very carefully step around them, like two people tiptoeing past a door they were both afraid to open, because behind that door was 20 years of friendship, and neither of us wanted to be the one responsible for it collapsing. The night everything changed started as the most unremarkable Thursday you could imagine. Naomi had come over after work like she did most Thursdays because that had become our thing over the past year, since both of us were single and both of us apparently preferred spending our evenings with each other over pretty much anyone else, though at the time we both still called that just being close friends. A phrase that, in hindsight, was doing an enormous amount of heavy lifting. I was making spaghetti badly because cooking has never been my strong suit, and Naomi was sitting on my kitchen counter, the way she always did, feet swinging, narrating the entire process like a very unimpressed cooking show judge. "Terrence, baby, that sauce is burning." "It's not burning, it's caramelizing." "Spaghetti sauce doesn't caramelize, that's not a thing, you're just burning tomatoes and calling it a technique." I turned around to argue with her, spatula in hand, and I don't even know exactly what happened in my brain in that half second. Whether it was exhaustion from a long week at work, or just 20 years of comfort finally spilling out somewhere it had never spilled before, But what came out of my mouth was, "All right, honey, you want to cook it yourself then?" The word just hung there in my kitchen, in the steam rising off that burnt sauce, and I heard it leave my mouth about half a second after it was already out there, already unretrievable, already sitting in the air between us like something neither of us could pretend hadn't happened. I froze. Naomi froze. The wooden spoon actually stopped moving in my hand. For a second, I panicked, running through my usual playlist of deflections, ready to laugh it off, say something like, "My bad," "force of habit," or, "Guess I've been watching too many cooking shows." Anything to smooth over the moment and get us both safely back onto familiar ground. But before I could get a single word of damage control out, Naomi tilted her head slightly, and this slow smile spread across her face, the kind of smile I'd genuinely never seen on her before in 20 years of friendship. Not once, and she said quietly, almost like she was testing the weight of her own voice as she said it, "Say it again." "What?" "You heard me, Terrence Boyd. Say it again." I stood there in my kitchen, spatula still in my hand, sauce still very much burning behind me on the stove, and I felt my heart doing something it had absolutely no business doing around my best friend of 20 years. "Honey," I said, quieter this time, testing it the same way she just tested her own request. Naomi didn't say anything for a long moment. She just looked at me, really looked at me, in this way that felt different from every single one of the thousands of times she'd looked at me before. And then she slid off the counter, walked over, turned off the stove burner behind me without even looking at it, like some kind of instinct, and said, "You've called me 100 nicknames in 20 years, Terrence. Nene, price tag, trouble, that one-time freshman year you called me gnomes, for like a solid month before I made you stop. But you have never, not once in 20 years, called me honey. So I need you to tell me right now if that was an accident, or if that's something that's been sitting in there for a while." I thought about lying. I really did, for maybe 2 full seconds, because lying felt safer. Lying felt like it would let us both go back to the version of our friendship that had worked, comfortably, easily, for 2 decades. But I was so tired, honestly, tired of the tiptoeing, tired of the careful subject changes, tired of Chantel's voice in the back of my head asking me to actually look at the difference she'd pointed out years earlier. "It's been sitting in there a while," I admitted. "Longer than I've probably let myself admit, even to myself." Naomi's eyes got a little glassy, and for a second I thought I'd made a terrible mistake, that I just detonated the best relationship of my adult life over one slipped word and a moment of honesty I couldn't take back. "How long, Terrence?" "I don't know exactly. Somewhere around the time Chantel and I were falling apart, if I'm honest. She said something to me right before she left, about the way I look at you. I told her she was wrong. I've spent about 2 years trying to actually believe that." "And do you believe it?" "No," I said. "I don't think I do. I think I've been in love with my best friend for a really long time, Naomi, and I think I've been so scared of losing 20 years of friendship over it that I just buried it. Every single time it tried to surface." Naomi let out this shaky breath, and then, to my complete surprise, she started laughing, this watery, relieved kind of laughing that didn't match the seriousness of the conversation at all, until she explained herself. "Derek used to say I compared every guy to a ghost," she said. "I told him that was ridiculous too. But Terrence, I think I've spent the last, 5 years, maybe longer, measuring every single man I dated against you, without ever letting myself actually think about what that meant. I told myself it was just because our friendship was so good, so comfortable, that nobody else could compete with a bar that high. But that's not actually what it was it? It was never really about the friendship being a hard bar to clear. It was that I already had exactly what I wanted, and I was too scared to ruin it by naming it. We stood there in my kitchen, 2 people who had known every single embarrassing, complicated, messy detail of each other's lives for 2 entire decades, suddenly looking at each other like we were meeting for the very first time, and in a way, honestly, we kind of were. "So what do we do with this?" I asked, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. Naomi stepped closer, close enough that I could see her weighing the same fear I was weighing. The fear that had kept both of us silent for years. The fear that naming this out loud might cost us the one relationship in either of our lives that had never once let us down. "I think," she said slowly, "we've spent 20 years being terrified of losing each other. And I think that fear has cost us both a lot of years we didn't need to lose." I don't want to keep being scared of this, Terrence. I'm tired of being scared of it. Me too, I said. I've been scared of it since before my marriage even ended, if I'm being completely honest. So stop being scared, Naomi said, and there was something so simple, so clear, in the way she said it, like she'd finally given herself permission to say the thing she'd been holding on to for years. Kiss me, and let's find out if 20 years of friendship was actually just the world's longest slow burn. I won't pretend I didn't hesitate standing there, because even in that moment, some old, careful part of my brain was screaming about what we might be risking. But I looked at Naomi Price, the girl who shared her sour candy with me on the back steps of Jefferson Elementary when we were both 11 years old and nobody else would sit with either of us. The woman who had shown up for every single hard moment of my adult life without ever once asking for anything in return, and I understood clearly, for maybe the first time, that the risk of losing her by staying silent had always been bigger than the risk of losing her by finally being honest. So I kissed her, in my kitchen, next to a pot of ruined spaghetti sauce, 20 years and one accidental word in the making. I won't drag out the details of what happened after that because some things are just for us, but I will tell you this. It was not, contrary to every cliché about best friends turned lovers, awkward, and it did not immediately ruin our friendship the way we'd both spent years being terrified it would. If anything, it felt like the most natural thing either of us had ever done, like every single conversation we'd had for 20 years had quietly been building toward exactly that moment, and once we finally let it happen, everything just clicked into place with this ease that honestly made both of us laugh about how long we'd wasted being scared. Of course, it wasn't instantly perfect after that. We had a lot of hard conversations in the weeks that followed, real conversations about what it would mean to try dating each other, about what we stood to lose if it somehow didn't work out, about whether we were even capable of separating best friend Naomi from girlfriend Naomi in our own heads, because for 20 years those had never needed to be different categories. We told our families together, sitting at my mother's kitchen table one Sunday afternoon, and I remember my mother, who had known Naomi since we were both children, just laughed and said, "Lord, finally. Your father and I had a bet going since you two were 17 years old. I believe I've won $40 off him tonight." Naomi's mother cried, actual happy tears, and told us both that she'd always secretly hoped, watching us grow up together, that one day we'd figure it out, but she never wanted to say anything and risk pushing us into something before we were ready. Because some things, she said, have to arrive on their own timeline or they don't really count. We dated for a year and a half before I proposed, which honestly felt like both the shortest and the longest engagement of anyone I know, because in one sense we'd only been officially together 18 months, but in another much truer sense we'd been building this relationship for 20 full years before either of us ever admitted what it actually was. I proposed in my kitchen, that same kitchen, standing in roughly the same spot where I'd accidentally called her honey that Thursday evening, because it felt right, it felt like the whole story deserved to circle back to where it actually started. "I've called you 100 things over the years," I told her, down on one knee, the ring box shaking slightly in my hand because I was more nervous than I'd expected to be, given that we'd basically been building toward this moment since we were 11 years old. Nay, price tag, trouble. But I only ever meant one of them the way I mean this next word. "Will you marry me, honey?" She said yes before I even finished getting the box fully open, laughing and crying at the same time in this way that had somehow, over the past 2 decades, become my absolute favorite sound in the entire world. We got married the following spring, in a small ceremony in my mother's backyard, the same backyard where Naomi and I used to do our middle school homework together at a rickety plastic table, decades before either of us understood what we were actually building toward. My mother gave a toast at the reception that made half the room cry, talking about watching 2 children share a bag of sour candy on some elementary school steps and somehow, 20 years later, watching those same 2 people promise to share the rest of their lives. Naomi's mother, in her own toast, said something that I think about often, something that stuck with me more than almost anything else said that entire day. She said, "People always ask how you know when you've found the one. I think the honest answer is sometimes you don't know because you've been standing next to them so long, being so comfortable, that you forget to ask the question at all. Sometimes it takes one accidental word, slipping out over a burnt pot of spaghetti sauce, to finally make you look at what's been standing right in front of you the entire time." We're coming up on our 4th wedding anniversary now, 24 years total since that day on the elementary school steps, and I still make spaghetti badly on purpose most Thursdays because it's become this small, private tradition between us, a way of honoring the exact moment everything changed. Naomi still sits on the kitchen counter while I cook, feet swinging, narrating my cooking failures with the same unimpressed commentary she's been giving me since we were kids, and every single time, without fail, at some point during that Thursday dinner, I look over at her and say it, quietly, like it's brand new every time even though it's been years now. "All right, honey." And every single time, she smiles that same slow smile from that very first night, and says, "Say it again." I think, if there's a lesson in all this, it's something about how the biggest, most important truths in our lives sometimes hide in the smallest, most accidental moments. 20 years of friendship, careful and comfortable and safe, and it took one slipped word, one moment where my guard was down enough to let something honest escape, to finally show us both what had been quietly true the entire time. We were so scared of ruining a good thing that we almost missed out on the best thing. And I think about that sometimes when I picture where we might have ended up if that sauce hadn't burned, if I hadn't turned around annoyed enough to let my guard slip, if Naomi had let me deflect the way I usually did instead of asking me to say it again. So if you've got a Naomi in your life, someone you've spent years being comfortable with instead of honest with, someone you've measured every other relationship against without ever letting yourself think too hard about why, do yourself a favor. Stop being so careful. Say the honest thing, even if it slips out sideways, even if it terrifies you. Sometimes the person on the other end of that honesty has been waiting 20 years for you to finally say it too.